Welcome to Silent Screams, where tonight we step into the world of eerie encounters and unsolved mysteries that lurk just beyond the edge of what we know. Here begins a tale of suspense, terror, and spine-chilling unknowns, a story shared from a time when someone's quiet night took a dark, unexpected turn. If you're listening alone, maybe reconsider and invite someone to share this haunting journey. Prepare yourself for a story where shadows hold secrets and silence is filled with dreadful anticipation. The clock ticked past midnight as Sarah sat in her living room, cradling a cup of lukewarm tea, her only companion in the dim, quiet house. The rhythmic ticking of the clock echoed through the empty room, amplifying the solitude that wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. She glanced at her phone screen, hoping for a distraction, but there were no messages, no missed calls, just the eerie silence of her secluded home in the countryside. It was a cold night, the kind that seemed to freeze sound itself. Only the faintest whisper of wind whistled outside, brushing through the bare branches that cast skeletal shadows against her walls. A sudden chill prickled her skin, and Sarah pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. As she sipped her tea, her eyes drifted towards the large window beside her, where the darkness outside felt thick and impenetrable, like it held secrets she wasn't meant to see. Her gaze lingered, her mind drifting to the strange stories she had heard about this place when she first moved in, a secluded old farmhouse, far from the nearest town. Locals had mentioned it in passing, whispering about its tragic past. There were rumors, unsettling ones, of the family that once lived here and the unspeakable horror they supposedly encountered on a night just like this. But Sarah had brushed it off as small-town gossip until tonight, when the silence felt different, heavier, as if it carried the weight of 1,000 untold stories. Lost in thought, Sarah barely noticed the faint sound, a soft creak, like a floorboard bending under an unseen weight. She froze, her heart pounding as she strained her ears, listening. There it was again, louder this time, a deliberate sound coming from somewhere deep within the house. Her rational mind dismissed it as the old house settling. A prickling sensation crept up her spine, urging her to stay alert. Her gaze darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just the dim shadows cast by the flickering lamp on her side table. Then she heard it, a whisper, so faint it was barely more than a breath, drifting from the hallway leading to the bedrooms. It was unintelligible, a soft murmuring that sent a cold shiver down her spine. She put down her cup and rose slowly, every sense on high alert. With hesitant steps, she walked towards the hallway, her heart racing as the whispers grew louder, filling the narrow corridor with an eerie, unearthly sound. She couldn't make out any words, just the haunting cadence of someone trying to speak. But there was no one else here. She was alone, wasn't she? Sarah's pulse quickened as she reached the end of the hallway. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence that seemed to press in on her. She took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself, but a flicker of movement caught her eye. Her gaze snapped to the door of the guest bedroom, which stood slightly ajar, as if inviting her inside. She had closed it earlier, she was certain. She felt a lump rise in her throat as she stepped forward, her hand trembling as she pushed the door open. The room was empty, bathed in the cold, pale glow of the moon filtering through the window. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw something, or rather, someone. A shadowy figure stood in the far corner, motionless, watching her with eyes that seemed to burn with an otherworldly intensity. Her breath caught in her throat, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the very air in the room was charged with a malevolent presence. The figure was indistinct, shrouded in darkness, yet there was something unmistakably human and yet not human about it. Its form wavered, as if it were struggling to exist in this reality, flickering in and out like a candle on the verge of being snuffed out. Sarah took a step back, but the figure remained, silent and unmoving, its gaze never wavering. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot, her voice strangled in her throat. The figure lifted a hand, a slow, deliberate movement, and pointed towards her, its fingers impossibly long and skeletal, tipped with shadowy claws that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a scream, it spoke a single word that echoed in her mind with a terrifying clarity. Leave. The word sent a jolt through her, snapping her out of her paralysis. She stumbled back, her heart pounding as she turned and fled down the hallway, not daring to look back. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more insistent, as if they were chasing her, filling her ears with their insidious voices. She reached the living room, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and grabbed her phone, her hand shaking so violently she could barely hold it. She dialed her best friend's number, praying for an answer, but the line was dead, replaced by strange static that filled her ears with a low, droning hum. She was about to throw the phone down in frustration when she saw it again, a shadow flickering just at the edge of her vision. It was in the corner of the room, hovering like a dark cloud, shifting and changing, taking on a more defined shape with each passing second. Her eyes widened in horror as the figure became clearer, more solid, its face twisted in a grotesque expression of anguish and rage. She could feel its gaze piercing through her, a cold, relentless stare that filled her with a paralyzing fear. It moved closer, its movement slow and deliberate, as if savoring her terror. Sarah backed away, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The figure's face was pale and gaunt, its eyes hollow, empty sockets that seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 tortured souls. Its mouth twisted into a sinister grin, revealing teeth that were sharp, jagged, like shards of broken glass. She could hear a faint dripping sound, like water trickling down from somewhere unseen. But as she glanced down, she realized it was coming from the figure itself, dark viscous liquid seeping from its eyes, its mouth, pooling on the floor beneath it. The sight was too much to bear, and Sarah felt her knees buckle as she collapsed onto the floor, unable to tear her gaze away from the horrific apparition that loomed over her. The figure knelt down, its face inches from hers, and she could feel its cold, foul breath against her skin, filling her senses with the stench of decay and rot. It opened its mouth, and a low, guttural moan escaped, a sound so full of sorrow and rage that it seemed to pierce her very soul. She clamped her hands over her ears, but the sound reverberated through her mind, growing louder, more deafening, until it was all she could hear, drowning out her own terrified screams. The room began to spin, the walls closing in around her as the darkness seemed to thicken, swallowing her whole. She felt herself slipping, her vision blurring as the figure reached out, its fingers brushing against her face with a touch that was both icy and searing, like fire and frost combined. She wanted to scream, to fight. Her body felt heavy, her mind clouded with a strange numbness that dulled her senses, trapping her in a waking nightmare from which there was no escape. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the figure vanished, leaving her alone in the silent, empty room. She lay there, trembling, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she struggled to regain her composure. The room was still, bathed in the cold, eerie glow of the moonlight, and for a moment, she wondered if it had all been a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and fear. But as she pushed herself to her feet, she saw it, a faint outline on the floor, a dark, oily stain where the figure had stood, a silent reminder that whatever she had seen was real, and it was far from gone.